Okay. So, like I said, I'm Allison Green. I serve as the Public Affairs Director for the Office of State Fire Marshal. Today, I'm going to be kind of acting as the Zoom wizard behind the scenes, making sure everybody's tech is working correctly. Definitely not going to be one of our presenters today, and also leading us through question and answer after our presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to one of our fire risk reduction specialists, Chris Paul, and he is going to walk us through introductions.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Chris Paul. I'm a fire risk reduction specialist for the Oregon Office of State Fire Marshal. My particular region covers the far 6 eastern counties, but there are 7 of us around the state. So every place in the state has one of us that works from there. We can reach out to us in the chat and we can connect you based on where you live with one of us. But today, this is one of the classes we want to put together going through our Fire Adapted Oregon initiative that came out of Senate Bill 762 in 2021. We're still working on implementing that, but we're partnering up with local fire districts, Forest Service, BLM, OSU Extension, and that's who we have here today is John Rizza and Caleb Bordelon from OSU Extension. I'll let them introduce themselves, and they're our subject matter experts in this field. Part of this webinar I wanted to bring is, we've spent a lot of time over the years talking about defensible space around homes and getting that, initial 5-foot zone, the 30-foot and the 100-foot. But beyond that, what actually affects our houses greatly is the embers that are coming from even outside those areas. So we wanted to move into the home hardening piece of this. And it can be overwhelming and daunting, but John and Caleb both spent a ton of time in this space working on strategies and advice to give to folks. So without any further words from me, I'll kick it over to John and Kayla. Thank you everyone for being here. And if you do have questions, throw them in the chat and we will answer them as we go.
Thanks, Chris. We're going to get started here, and I just wanted to say Kayla and I are kind of sharing this presentation, so we'll break it up a little bit, and you guys can hear a little from each of us. So, Kayla, thanks a lot.
John and Allison and Chris as well. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And as Chris said, I'm with OSU Extension's Fire Program. I cover the Willamette Valley and the North Cascades region, and John covers Eastern Oregon with OSU Extension's Fire Program. So yeah, today we're really excited to share some best practices from the research on home hardening. And I'll go ahead and spend a little time on the kind of bigger picture stuff and then hand it over to John to give us some specifics on best practices for hardening your home. So yeah, home hardening, what does this mean, right? Home hardening is the process of either building or retrofitting your home, or it could be other structures, like a detached garage or a barn, any structure, to increase its survivability in the event of a wildfire. So it's really about providing a defense system from the outside of your house to protect against wildfire ignition, okay? So in this photo here, we can see the difference. This is a model house. It's using standard construction on the left side and a hardened home approach on the right side. So this is about materials, it's about design, and it's about all the maintenance things that you can do to increase the chances that your home survives the wildfire. And the guidance that we'll share today is really backed by the science. There's a lot of research going on right now about what we call the home ignition zones. That includes home hardening, also that defensible space part that Kyle talked about in yesterday's webinar. And yeah, this is coming from all over the place, and people are digging into really the nitty gritty of what we can do in the home hardening space. So in this picture, this is actually in a lab at the IBHS Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. So you're seeing here a simulated wildfire that's exposing both sides of this structure equally. So all of these best practices that we're going to offer today are really coming from this big body of knowledge that's being generated around home hardening. All right, so how do wildfires become house fires? So we think that, understanding a little bit of the science around home ignition can help you as a homeowner really puzzle through how to prioritize how you approach home hardening, and make all of those decisions about what you prioritize, what you wait on, etc. So we want to share a little bit of that today. So there's really 3 ways that a wildfire can ignite a home or another structure, and I'm going to talk about them in reverse order. So one is conduction, or direct flame contact with the fire, right? That's kind of what we imagine maybe, or we see in movies, a big wall of flame kind of consuming everything in its path, right? The second way is radiation, or this is heating from nearby vegetation, or it could be a nearby house, right? If you live in a dense neighborhood, it might be the house next door catches fire and produces enough radiant heat to ignite your own house. But what we find is that the primary culprit for home loss in wildfire is actually something very small, and that's embers, okay? Somewhere between 70 and 90% of home losses are from these flying embers that land, on your house, that get blown into your house, or that land around your structure. So what are these flying embers? So imagine sparks that come up from a campfire. These are these small bits of burning fuel that are kind of wafted into the air, all right? Now imagine a much larger shower of sparks, right, that are pushed by the wind from the burning front of a wildfire, or it could be from burning structures nearby. Okay, these ember showers can be pushed sometimes a mile ahead of the fire. And, when embers land on your roof, when they get blown into your vents, when they pile up around the perimeter of your house, we want to make sure that 2 things happen. One, that they're blocked from entering your home, and 2, that they land on a non-combustible surface outside your home and self-extinguish, okay? So let's look at both of those ways. So the first is ember intrusion, embers getting into your house. Okay, this is what it could look like as an example from the interior of an attic. This is a model attic from IVHS. And I circled all of the embers that are coming in through that attic vent so you could see them a little more clearly. Okay, so many homes have attic vents that they're really designed to push hot air out, right? But in a windy time in a fire, they could actually serve as kind of a doorway to embers entering your home, right? And once embers are in your attic, this attic is fairly clean, but many of us store a lot of things in our attics, and these embers can ignite that kind of flammable combustible material. Okay, so attic vents aren't the only place, and John's going to talk a lot about what we can do to seal and screen. We have vents around our foundations. We have the vents in our closed-in eaves. Windows are a place where embers could intrude possibly. There's all sorts of places where we want to seal and screen to prevent this ember intrusion, and we'll get into those specifics. And then the other way that embers can ignite our homes is through that exterior ignition. And so I want to provide an example of that as well. So this is some video footage from the Marshal fire in Colorado. This was a really destructive fire that burned over 1,000 structures. And unfortunately, this house was one of those that was lost in the fire. And we can actually see from this little cam that they had on their garage that how this happened, right? So let's look here, right around the perimeter of their house, they have this debris kind of building up. And then this, kind of unfortunately placed piece of plywood, which I don't know about you, but, it's not hard to have a few things lying around your place, So what happens here is as we progress in time, we see that that debris was lit by embers landing in what basically amounted to kindling, right, for these embers. That debris ignited the piece of plywood, and the piece of plywood ignited the siding of the house. And that siding burned through and exposed the inner sheathing. So this is how, home loss can occur from these tiny little embers landing on the exterior of your house. Often it's about these small things like maintenance issues. So now that we know how embers lead to home loss, we can start thinking about strategies to be more ember prepared. And this image here shows a lot of different kind of points of vulnerability or opportunity areas that we might want to focus on when we think about reducing the chances of ember ignition. And I think there's about 21 listed here, and there may be more. And John will talk a lot about these and other places where we can kind of prioritize reducing ember ignition. But I wanted to show this to you because it's maybe overwhelming to think about all of these different priority areas all at once. And we might need kind of some ways of thinking through what to prioritize first. So we found this graph really useful that sort of breaks down the relative cost and priority ratio for these various tasks that we can take on to increase our chances of home survival. So for example, over on the super high priority and super low cost side, we have maintenance. So that's a really great thing, right? That the highest priority thing, the thing that will make the biggest difference in reducing your chances of ember ignition is also the thing that maybe costs a lot of kind of sweat equity, but doesn't cost a lot of money. So we think about, clearing up that debris around the base of that house in the Marshal fire, removing those things like that plywood, and what a big benefit that could be. On the far end of the spectrum, on the other side, we look at something like siding. Here we see that relatively high cost compared to some of these other activities, relatively low priority in terms of improving your chances of survivability. So that might be something that we put off until we've taken care of some of our other priorities. So this just helps us give a glimpse of kind of where we might get the most bang for our buck. And John's going to take it from here, looking at all of these issues in depth and offering some best practices for how we go about improving those chances. Go for it.
Thanks, Kayla. Appreciate you setting the stage for us. So I want y'all to kind of take a mental note of this graph and think about it as we go through the next, handful of minutes and slides, kind of talking about how to look at this. So the very first thing, go ahead, Kayla, there is our vents. That's something that you saw in the materials that Kayla was showing you. It's pretty simple to get this from what we standard and typically see as a 1/4 inch mesh screening down to that 1/8 inch mesh screening. And so you can even overlay it. You don't have to pull things apart, but you can see in all our little vents, whether they're in our eaves or our soffits or our down low in different places, you can see the embers coming right in through that larger screening. Now there are a lot of products that are made directly by manufacturers that do have the proper screening and are rated for dealing with this situation here. So if you are building or remodeling, it's something you could consider. If you're just wanting to do some maintenance and kind of address this, it's something you can easily pick this non-combustible mesh screening up. So that's a key piece. It can't be the regular old school kind of fiberglass, plasticky stuff. We want a non-combustible mesh screening. And get some of these done. You can buy them in rolls at the local hardware store, but make sure they're rated properly so they're non-combustible. The next thing we want to really talk about are our windows, and these are a really significant point of entry. The recommendations I'll get into just a little bit more specifically in just a second, but we can see that it's a really good place for embers to collect, as you saw in some of those diagrams and videos that Kayla showed earlier. They pile up in one spot and they can ignite. And so here's a vinyl clad screen. So that's that non-proper screening. So it's combustible material. Those embers can pile up in these corners and ignite that screening. And then there it goes off to the races. And so if we have the proper setup and the proper screening, now here's what's really typical is a lot of us have vinyl windows on the exterior. Those will also start melting, but there are windows that are rated for pretty good ability to withstand the pressure from embers. So this can be melted and damaged, but never got in on this particular picture. So it shows that if you have a decent, well a good grade window, even if it is vinyl, it can probably withstand a pretty good amount. So we want to stick away from those materials that I discussed. So go ahead to the next one. We'll talk a little bit about how we reduce the vulnerability of our windows. And so this is a key piece. That screen is really important. You can choose to remove your screens on the wind side, so where the wind comes from and goes towards your home, or you can choose to go ahead and buy some of that non-combustible screening material and replace those screens. Don't use that as something, I'll just go around and pull all the screens before we have to leave. If there's an evacuation situation, that's not ideal. We want to have things set up ahead of time so we don't have to worry about that, and we can make sure we're being safe. And double pane windows are a key recommendation from the experts on how to do this. And so if you're looking to replace your windows, make sure you're getting the right windows that can withstand this kind of pressure from embers specifically, and heat in general. If you do have shutters and you want to use those and make them functioning shutters, which is a reasonable thing, they should be non-combustible and not be gapped, so not have holes everywhere. You want to have tempered windows as well. That's another important piece of this. Oftentimes our doors are tempered, but our windows are not. So you could upgrade those to tempered all across all your windows if you're replacing those. And then make sure that those windows are closed properly and latched, because if they're not latched, they could get enough wind, and you know what happens in a windy situation. It can work that window open enough to allow those embers to get inside. So latch those windows when you're leaving. Doors and garages are the next thing we're going to talk about, and they're really another important place. We would think that, our door's closed, no big deal, but as you can see up in the top picture up here, the frame of that door can be a good place for embers to accumulate and allow that ignition to occur right there. And so in this situation here, an easy remedy would be to strip that down and repaint it so it's nice good wood. If it's starting to rot out, replace that door jamb and frame on there. But a good coat of paint, good high quality paint would really go a long way in making sure that's properly caulked. And you can see here in the garage on the bottom left side here, your gaskets on your garage are also something that's pretty simple to fix up and maintain. Make sure they're adjusted properly and create a nice good tight seal against that garage door, both on the bottom and the side, all sides and the top. So if those need some adjustment, it's usually a pretty easy move, or maybe they need to be replaced because they're old and the rubber's not real good, and you can replace those. It just helps to keep the embers, when they hit it, they fall to the ground down to that concrete, and we're in a pretty good place. If this is a really pretty extreme situation here where we have herbicides, pesticides laying all over the place, an open carport underneath this nice facility. So get good doors and windows, store your things properly, make sure they're locked up according to, having them in a safe, secure storage spot, so that if a firefighter does come in for suppression activities, they're going to walk up to this and turn right around and leave, because that's a pretty toxic situation. So get that stuff closed up and do the best we can, and maybe they can hang out and try and help you guys defend your space a little bit. So moving along here, let's kind of shift to some of the different construction techniques we could implement here. I'm going to start at the roof and work my way kind of down. So there's different ratings for roofs, from A, B, C, and then unrated as well. And these are tested and rated in every shingle that's produced out there with a good name brand quality shingle has got a rating, and you can request those different kinds of ratings, classifications. And so basically, if it can withstand and get a certificate for an A rating, it's really a high exposure. So that's a big piece of burning material that they'll set on the surface, and it has to last, I think 30 minutes. It has to have that exposure total and be able to withstand that. So a Class A roof can really get that going. You can see in the non-Class A roof on the bottom picture there, that same exact rated brand, if you will, what they're calling those are their brands, move through that roof at a pretty quick rate there. So after like a minute and a half on the top roof that's Class A rated, it didn't do any damage to the structure. It just burned off and the roof was in good shape. Now you might want to evaluate that, but the roof was able to withstand the fire brand, whereas in Class A, after that same minute and a half, that fire ember brand was able to burn right through that roof. So let's talk a little bit more about the actual roof pieces. On the next one here, we'll talk and focus just on the A roof because that's our kind of top tier. And I wanted to note that most fiberglass, good, high quality shingles have a Class A rating. However, not all of them do. So specifically, the manufacturer will have that labeled. You can ask for that certificate for that. Clay tiles typically are rated as well. Concrete and slate, those are non-combustible materials. But I would go the extra effort because what they're doing in a lot of products is mixing them with other materials to fabricate that, piece of roofing. And so make sure that it actually has a certificate and you understand what that looks like if you're really wanting to go to that route, if you're replacing it. Now, there's a whole roof assembly that also can get a rating. And so it's the sheathing, it's the resistant layer, and the covering on there that all combine together. And so you may have a Class B fire rated covering, but you have a resistant layer underneath that, and then you have a rated layer of the roofing sheathing as well. And so you can have the top layer or the whole construction of the total assembly being rated. And those are things that the recommendations can come from the manufacturer on how your roofing contractor can install those. And they're usually pretty good at understanding how to do that. Now, most metal roofs are going to have that A, but again, they might have some materials mixed in there on those roofs. And so make sure if that's what you want, you get that. And then the whole system needs to be rated because a lot of metal roofs have corrugations, which I'll show you here on the next slide, that are really going to kind of allow intrusion. And so here's that picture where you can get embers inside this space here, but there are materials that will clog those spaces up and that are fire rated. So if you want that, you have to have that entire roof system done. So if you slap the metal roof on a regular roof system, it might not get you that fire rating you're looking for. And so there's things pretty simply you can do. If you have one of these roofs, they actually have retrofit guides, materials that you can install in those roof materials to give you that extra layer of protection. And you can see here, this is just an example of the entire roofing system that would really get you a long way. So here's that 1/4-inch mesh screen soffit underneath. The fascia is a fire resilient material. We have a sheathing that's rated and then the roof covering. And so the whole thing is constructed with this in mind, and all the gaps are filled and all the proper trims are put in. And you can see down here in the bottom left-hand side, these folks are getting proper. So they have that black piece of more fire resilient material that's being part of your flashing up against the install. And so they're making sure those gaps are all sealed up. And then they use the standing seam roof that's crimped, and so embers can't get into that. And then you can also see up here in these other two shots, that we have some roofs that potentially could use some retrofitting. And then also the maintenance aspect that Kayla touched on earlier, where we do have the proper ember intrusion figured out, but we need to make sure we maintain that because those materials can break down over time. So let's shift from the roofs and go down to the deck and talk a little bit about some pretty valuable things that you could do on a deck that's already installed. And then I'll touch a little bit about things that you could do on building a new deck if you're looking to put one in. So we can definitely don't want to forget about using the fact that there are combustible materials that accumulate in our deck. And you can see the one picture here has the needles and debris that's jammed in between the deck and the siding, and then the wood siding. And so that's a tough situation right there. But these decks are part of our structure. And so we want to have everything from underneath the deck to the decking materials and what's on top of the deck, all considered as part of the system that we're going to put in place here. Those embers can wash over those decks and sit there and burn out, and I'll show you that in a second, but then they can also get through, and if we have materials stacked up underneath or anything that's combustible, that can create some issues. So deck boards have a flame spread index like roofs do. A little different way they test them, but really similar approach with the same kind of 12 by 12 blocking ember, if you will, that they showed earlier. And we're trying to measure what that flame growth is. And so Class A would be our fiber cement type products. There are some of these PVC type products, like Trex type products, that are actually rated. That doesn't mean that all of them are, but some of them are rated A. A lot of our wood products can be listed as a Class B. And then, when we're looking at a kind of less expensive softwood or pine type covering, that can be your Class C, where those embers can really go. This is a side-by-side difference. So this is just Class A on the right side versus Class B on the left side. You can see how much difference they were ignited at the exact same amount of time. So there's the same time lapse on here. That on the Class C side has burned right through and fallen. And now we got ignitions all over the place on this left side, whereas the Class B ember burned out and was able to kind of extinguish itself and is now no longer a threat to your structure. So there's some really slight things you could do to change your ability for your home to withstand this. On the next one, we'll talk a little bit about some of the new construction opportunities. If you're putting on a new deck or looking at it, there are some really good, again, systems. We want to think about everything from how we build it to how we flash it to the proper materials we put in place. And so thinking about everything from the joists and the columns all the way up to the decking. The bigger the material, the better the rating typically. So a 3-inch thickness will do a little better than a standard 2-inch thickness, and so on. So using some bigger timbers, they show, typically a lot of decks will be built out of 4x4 columns. This is a fire rated deck here, so it's built out of a 6x6 column. Just a little bit larger material helps to create that ability for that material to withstand more embers affecting it. You can also see there's other ideas on, well, I have an old deck, but I want to do something else. Okay, we can put over a membrane and then flash it properly and put on some sort of a non-combustible covering. I typically don't recommend these things, but if it's a situation that is going to work, that can work well. I would suggest more, let's take that down to the studs or down further and then rebuild that deck properly. And then you can see just some tips on how to flash these things. You don't have to flash the entire joist, but you could flash the 5 feet up to against the house and then flash up to the house underneath that cladding or that siding, and then make sure everything's all tight and the whole system is in place there. So that's about what we got for decks. We'll move on to potentially, instead of having a deck, how about a walkout patio kind of situation? Non-combustible patios would be pavers and others. Here's a bunch of examples. This is a couple different pavers actually worked on in some different places where we were doing some work. So we pushed back that combustible zone and we have nice patios in here. Now you have to remember to maintain these. You can use gravel and combination of pavers or concrete for that matter. You can still have plants, make it look really nice, but it gives you a little bit more buffer. So embers can come. Here are big timbers. We sealed these up with good flashing. Everything's done proper. The seal on these is a good stain, good high quality stain. And then, we put these pavers in and everything's flashed proper, so there won't be any ember intrusion. Same with this. We came in and we would get this reflashed and fixed up nice. This was getting replaced with some hardy siding on the house and good pavers on there. You don't have to do all of this, but anything you can do to make it a little better situation really helps out. So let's say you already have a deck. Well, we talked a little bit about that retrofitting thing, and I just kind of wanted to emphasize one more time. You don't have to replace the whole deck, but think about, well, let's take out this board that's closest to the house and look at putting some fresh flashing in against the ledger board and then replacing that board that's closest to the house, getting a little bit of cleaning out the gaps and replacing it with a non-combustible material right up against the house. And then also consider just replacing the bottom piece of siding or flashing as well with something that's non-combustible. So you can do a little bit to go a long way without having to redo everything. What about underneath the decks? Well, this is a really prevalent issue that we see a lot of. Don't put things that are combustible underneath your deck. It is not a place for storage if you live in a wildfire risk place. And so clean that out. And also, they talk a lot about clean, and green. Well, we want to get that green away from that material, so there's no option for fuel under there. And so these guys were cutting this stuff down and then putting some rock in there, and then also cutting the vegetation down on this corner. If your deck is screened, make sure you get your leaf blower in there every so often and clean that flammable material out of there. But this right here in the middle is probably the best looking situation where you got good rock, everything's flashed right, it's all cleaned out. So that's some tips on how to really reduce that underneath space. So let's shift a little bit to what about coverings on decks? It's really important. The recommendation is that proper maintenance with good finishes that aren't flaking off will contribute better to our high fire hazard areas and mitigating that. And so a lot of data has come out suggesting that fire coatings, those retardant coatings, are not appropriate. They break down over time in the sunlight and are not recommended to be used. Instead, just have really good high quality paints and stains that are well maintained is a much better way to look at this. You can see up here in the top, they have an oil base on the redwood deck versus without an oil base, just regular weathered. And you can see how the difference is over time. This nice high quality stained decking material withstands the ember intrusion much better than just the weathered decking. And so that gives you a better chance over time to really withstand those embers and those other burning materials that are going to inevitably land on your deck in one of these situations. Also, at any time we have a lot of this where the water kind of keeps running off in a consistent place, check those spots because embers can get in where there's that board rot really easily. And so it doesn't matter that it looks decent. Let's really check those and poke them, and maybe you get the screwdriver out. You might not have to replace that, but maybe you scrape it off and put a nice fresh solid coat of paint on, so when those embers hit it, instead of sitting on it, they hit it and bounce off. So let's also talk a little bit about what can you do for your siding. This is a really pretty drastic, if you will, situation on the far right hand side here. The vinyl siding that's not rated will just melt. Well, what does that do? That exposes the sheeting behind that. And so you really want to consider what kind of material you have on the side of your house. Now, it can withstand a lot of embers, and this wasn't an ember intrusion situation. This was where you can see all the fire got real close and just melted that stuff right off the side. They were fortunate, but this house sustained significant damage. Didn't lose the whole structure, but pretty damaged. So vinyl siding is very low resilience to any sort of pressure from fire. So good paint, good caulk. If you have a log home, that was that bigger material, so it can withstand that, but our caulking needs to be updated. And so this homeowner was going through and they were re-chinking all the logs really nicely and getting all that sealed up. And you can see how they were sealing up all the cracks and all that and cleaning things up really good. Here's the best situation is this fiber siding cement. So the fiber and wood composite, so this would be a standard kind of wood siding on the left side, and then the fiber like hardy type siding on the right side. They were exposed to the same exact burning materials, and you can see how quickly the wood composite siding went up versus the fiber siding. And so if you're looking at residing your house and you're in this area, consider going towards this better product. The other cool thing about the fiber cement products is typically they can come pre-painted, so that's less work, and they require less inputs for maintenance for painting over time, typically. So and especially if they're installed properly. So there's some really cool things that can be done there. So how about the fencing? Because a lot of times we have fences that go right up against the house, right up against our siding. Lattice fencing is probably some of the worst stuff. It's really thin, has a lot of holes, has a lot of surface area, really good ways for embers to hit it and get in there. Keep those fences clear, move them away. Consider a non-combustible fence for the last 5 or so minimum feet up against your house. And so here in the picture on top, you can see how they went from a standard kind of wood fence and then transitioned to a non-combustible fencing material. So it looks really nice, functions well, and really doesn't allow anything to get a hold of it. There are products that are fire rated. Here's an example of a Trex fire rated fencing product. But again, not all of them are rated. And so make sure you get that certificate from the manufacturer before you say, yep, I'm good and we're in a good place, because we want to make sure we understand our risks. So the last thing I want to touch about, people ask us this all the time about sprinkler systems. I'm not saying they're a bad thing, but I'm also not saying they're a good thing. What happens if the power goes down? What happens if your well pump is out? What happens if the water supply isn't there? They require a lot of maintenance. You have to blow them out every fall, make sure they're working properly constantly during the fire season. However, you can, if this is something you want to look into, they're pretty expensive at times. The cost is getting a little better. But we can install these with a design system. There are really good companies out there that have these things. Don't just throw some sprinklers on and think you're in a good place. You got to make sure it's designed proper, water delivery, all that. I don't typically recommend these because there's just so many variables on here. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't do that. Here are some pros. They can be really effective. They can help extinguish the flames. There's lots of cons as well. If you have something malfunction, if the power goes down, as I mentioned, that maintenance aspect is key. If you don't ever check this all year and the water hardens off and that sprinkler can't get out there proper and get that done, you're going to want to really make sure you're keeping up with all that. High wind events, a lot of this stuff happens when it's really windy and that sprinkler can just blow sideways and the embers can get on there anyway. And then making sure you have plenty of water because you want to get that going ahead of time and then have it happen after the fire front gets there. And so it's really important. You don't just go grab some sprinklers out of Home Depot and throw them on your roof. That wouldn't really be very valuable because they're plastic. You have to get well-rated, good, high-quality systems. There's a lot of things right there. Not saying it's not a good idea, but I recommend looking at how you want to approach this and thinking about how we can have all the tools in our tool belt. Let's harden our structure for that passive approach. And if you want to go towards the active approach, you can make sure you're looking at designing something like this. So that's about all I have for those building materials, construction things. Happy to take some questions when we're done here, but Kayla's going to kind of shift into some maintenance and kind of wrapping us up as we kind of think about how we can help reduce some of these issues.
Great. And we won't really talk about these too much, but just want to remind us, and as John is saying, this is part of a system, right? So we have the home hardening stuff that happens, right on the home, but then we also have defensible space that happens outside of that. And Kyle Reed's webinar yesterday was awesome on covering that stuff. And I will just kind of touch on this non-combustible zone that is the best practice for right around your place, around your structure. As John mentioned with under decks, this is the area where we really want to minimize the chances of ember ignition. And it is a place where embers pile up, right? So, I'm over in Western Oregon. We typically use a lot of mulch or bark chips to kind of spread around the exterior of our houses. We're really looking at replacing that stuff with rock, gravel, concrete, pavers, something non-combustible, because that mulch is actually a great little bed for embers to land in and ignite. All right, and then we've really come full circle back to our highest priority and lowest cost structure hardening task, this routine maintenance that never ends. There's always something we could be doing any season of the year. We want to just highlight keeping your roof clear of debris, that roof being that most vulnerable part of your house. Think about that debris is going to accumulate in the same corners and nooks and crannies and edges of your roof that embers are likely to accumulate in the event of a fire. So those are places that you really want to keep cleaned out. Gutters should be screened and cleaned. We want to make sure, obviously, that our gutters are, non-combustible as well. So metal gutters, metal screens, otherwise those gutters themselves could catch fire. You might still get some debris buildup on top of those screens, like we're seeing if you use this type of screen. So you can get up there with a leaf blower or something. It makes it a little easier than cleaning out your actual gutters. And, keep in mind that we should be doing that right ahead of fire season and then kind of throughout fire season, making sure that that's all cleaned out. Don't forget to move firewood or anything else that's piled up around your house out from about 30 feet out is the best practice for firewood storage. might feel like winter in Oregon still right now, but as soon as you stop using your wood stove this season, it's a great time to get that wood off your porch, away from your home. So, you're not chucking firewood off your deck in the middle of what should be an evacuation time. So that's important. And then also, just as John said, remember that anything that's attached to your house is part of your house. That's how we think of it in terms of reducing these ember ignitions. So if you do have a combustible attached fence or a deck, you want to create that non-combustible space around those attachments as well, and keep those clean all the time. One final thing with maintenance that I wanted to touch on is what we think of as temporary fuel. So like your trash can that you might roll right up against your house, or maybe you have a car that's parked against your house that you're not using. Anything that is vulnerable to embers getting into it and it igniting, that can be a really significant source of radiant fuel on your house in the case of a fire. Okay, and then I just want to kind of span out a little bit and think a little bit beyond our property lines, right? In particular, if you live in a denser neighborhood, your biggest exposure might be the house next door or the garage or the shed on your neighbor's property, right? So if that's the case, you might want to beef up some of your home hardening on that side of your house. For example, getting those double paned tempered glass windows installed on that side of your house if you want to prioritize, one place, because that's going to be the side that's exposed to more radiant heat if, in the event that the neighbor's house catches on fire. And you also want to be a good neighbor, right? So when you move your firewood stack 30 feet away from your own house, make sure that it's not 10 feet from your neighbor's barn or their place. And we want to take care of each other in this way, because really fire, doesn't care about property lines. And we're all in this together, kind of working in this bigger system. And, I know it's hard sometimes, but working with your neighbors is also a great opportunity to build a sense of, all of us being in this together and working towards shared goals. And this is a picture from a Firewise community in Benton County. And I've seen some of the Firewise folks from Benton County on the call today. And they host a neighborhood dumpster day every year in May, where folks can bring their yard debris and get it hauled off for free. People really enjoy it, and it's a great opportunity for the neighborhood to come together. And that really brings us to the bigger context that we do home hardening in, okay? So to be fire ready, home hardening is one piece of a much bigger puzzle. So home hardening is down here on the right side where it says fire ready homes, right? Yesterday, Kyle presented on defensible space. That's that first 100 feet around your home. That's part of the system too, okay? Another piece of the puzzle. We have prepared people, right? I'm gonna add animals, okay? Because we wanna make sure that we're ready, our family's ready, all of the animals that we have, under our care are ready, that we have an emergency plan, we're signed up for emergency notifications, we're ready to evacuate if needed, we're ready for smoke. All that stuff, right, is about being prepared. And in our forests, both private land, public land, we try to use ecosystem-specific ways to create buffers that reduce risk to our communities, and then also manage our forests to be ready for wildfire, and at the same time, support all of our forest health objectives as well. So it's an all of the above approach, right, to fire resilience. It really does take this whole system, whole community approach. All right, and before we turn it over for Q&A, we just wanted to share a couple of ideas for first steps and some resources that you could dig into this topic more with, and kind of get moving on some of this stuff. So really, one of the first steps that you can take is to assess your own place, right? And there are so many assessment tools out there, from the most simple to much more detailed, much more place specific. The one that we have in red and yellow here is from the Firewise program through the NFPA. The one on the right-hand side is, it was a collaboratively made assessment tool that's much more in-depth, that's particular to Wallowa County. So my recommendation would be that you check in with your local fire folks. That could be your local fire department, the ODF office nearby, the Office of the State Fire Marshal, or one of us extension specialists to figure out what checklist makes the most sense for your area. And you know, you get the added benefit there of the possibility that one of these experts could come out and help you with that home assessment. I know OSFM is standing up a program to do that, and then, you know, local fire departments as well quite often have that program and can offer that kind of service. And just to go back, the other thing that you can do if you already have a pretty good handle on what your priorities are is go ahead and start knocking out some of that spring maintenance. You know, that stuff, again, is something that you could always be working towards little by little. And if you want to kind of nerd out on some of this stuff and get into more fire preparedness learning, I just wanted to share our website with you. The OSU Fire Program has an awesome bunch of webinars on fire preparedness and even post-fire recovery. I just put that in the chat. And then, yeah, you can even use this QR code to get into our webinar series on fire preparedness. We also offer a lot of publications from, you know, the home ignition zone, like the stuff we're talking about today, out to your kind of forest land properties. And then one more resource that I love and just had to put in here is this home retrofit guide that comes out of the extension programs in Nevada and California. And I'm going to put a link to that. It's a free download from the internet. And this is really specific to home hardening. And I just think it's a great guide. It's, you know, a lot of great information laid out really nicely, easy to follow along. All right, with that, I think John and I just want to thank you all for your interest in this topic, and thank Allison and Chris for the opportunity to come in and share these ideas with y'all. And I'll turn it back over to Allison.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for joining us over lunchtime and sharing all of your knowledge with us. You know, at the end of the day, wildfire preparedness is a really big topic. And so, you know, looking at how defensible space and home hardening interact, and that frankly, once you have them both together, it really increases your chances, right, of being safe. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk us through. We had some really, really great questions in the chat, as well as some great info on kind of some options for folks to kind of keep an eye on. And John, I saw you were in there answering questions, but for some of our folks that either aren't looking at the chat or some of those things, I may read them out anyway, just so we can kind of work through a couple of those. So Phil had some great notes in here around like some watch out points for ridge vents and a couple of other items to consider on specific roofing. But he did have a question around how folks can tell the difference between tempered glass windows and double pane windows.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And so typically down in the corner somewhere on the window is going to be a little stamp. It's kind of translucent, kind of hard to see. It might fade out over time, but that stamp should be etched in the corner somewhere that says tempered. There are also some online resources that give you if it taps a certain way and things like that, but you could also call the local window guy, have him come out, he'll tell you. They have a tool that scans it. So those are a couple ways. Most of our doors are, but not all of them, so check your doors as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then, you know, he also put in here that, you know, the windows that he was talking about, they were Energy Star, you know, so they were acceptable to kind of consumer power, right? So a lot of times what I've found in this work is some of the things we do for wildfire preparedness help with things like energy efficiency on our home. For me personally, on the east side of the mountains, it helps with snow drainage. You know, Kayla was talking about kind of those non-flammable areas right next to the house, and I found actually putting in a rock barrier around my house helped with the snow drainage. So there's all these kind of silver linings to some of this defensible space work as well.
Look at material costs. You know, if it's going to be, you know, 3 to 5% more to go with a cement board for your siding versus going back to the wood siding that you had or whatever, take a serious look at that. You know, and maybe it takes an extra year to budget that in and for that extra savings, but, you know, looking at that true cost of the material versus the, you know, the cost benefit ratio of that. So something to think about. The other one is an exercise that I've done at my own home to try to kind of ground truth it, is if you have a pellet stove or a smoker or something, take a handful of those pellets, throw them at the side of your house. Everywhere that those pellets land are places that embers are going to land as well. Take a look at those and see, those little nooks and crannies. If you count them out in your hand and say, okay, I threw 50 of them and you can't find all of them, those are embers, that potential embers and potential places they can land. So it's just it's a quick little simple exercise you can do on your own. So I'm going to kick it back to Allison for her to finish her thought.
Oh man, well, I don't know when I lost y'all. All of a sudden I realized everybody had a frozen smile on their face, like my Zoom restarted. So I will say I'm not sure where we landed in the chat. So you guys might need to help guide me on that. Mr. Paul, you can let me know where we landed. I will say one question that I saw in there, and you can stop me if it did get addressed. Phil had a couple of great questions about where the home hardening code or the structural fire code is. And so what I would really highly recommend, I will drop the link in the chat. And just so that we're, complete transparency here, there was a lot of movement around, talk around a defensible space code, as well as a home hardening code statewide based on risk. And so where we're kind of at right now is because the map was paused and kind of considering and revamping for feedback. All of those codes are educational documents. They're draft, but they are not code, nor are they required anywhere in the state. And so where the map is in process, they are kind of waiting to see how the legislature shakes out and any new direction they have from the decision makers on where exactly they want to head. But I will drop a note. Building Codes Division is the keeper of the home hardening code, and they have draft language in there, right? So if you really want to go in, see what that code is looking like in its draft form right now, then you can take a peek at that. So I just wanted to address that question and not miss it in the shuffle here.
And I'd like to add real quick, Allison, that, sure, there might be regs, codes, whatever, but do the best you can to get yourself in a place that you feel safe. That's the key piece of this. Like we're not going to touch on our go bags and all these other things, but do what you feel is going to give you some peace of mind if something were to happen, and really understand how do we take action, because it really comes down to us moving the needle as a community, as a group, as a neighborhood. And so that's where we really wanted to show you that graph that says, here are some ways you can think about it. This is really low cost, but a really good thing you can do to implement on your place. Whether there's funding or not, you can maintenance, or you could hire somebody to come in and do maintenance for not so much, and think about how you do this stuff over time. We don't have to do it today or tomorrow, but let's move towards getting that more resilient structure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm going to quote Mr. John Rizza here in something that I carried forward that he said once. Do one thing. Start somewhere. This can all be overwhelming and whatnot, but start somewhere. Start with that one thing, even if it's just the maintenance piece, and then work your way out from there. Talk with your neighbors. If one of them's doing screening and is real comfortable doing that, make a trade with them. Say, hey, I'll go around and rake all the stuff away from your house if you'll get up on the ladder and take a look at my screens. Going back to the way this country was built, which is neighbors helping neighbors, and building communities that way. So, great conversation around all this. And even with the codes not being there and whatnot, like John mentioned earlier in the chat, best management practices. Any of us are more than willing to come out and give you all the technical advice in the world on what you can and can't do, or what you should and shouldn't do, what works, what doesn't work based on our experience, but you don't have to wait for someone to make you do it. And if you're in a situation like was mentioned earlier, to where, you're doing all the work on your house, but that neighbor's house that's 10 feet away from you isn't doing the work, talk to them. If that doesn't work, well, maybe you need to harden up your side of the house, the side of your house next to them more. So that's all I've got.
Okay, and so with my technical glitch, I also lost a little bit of the chat. So we only have 4 minutes. So I will say, I did also see a note in there about grants for home hardening. Right now, the grants that Building Codes Division offers is for those that are in the recovery phases from the 2020 wildfires. They are looking at expanding that program depending on how much money they're able to get. But that is kind of wait and see until the summer to see if those programs are available. But I may pause for 4 minutes, see if anybody either wants to unmute or pop one more question or two in the chat before we let you get on with your Thursday.
I was going to mention, Allison, real quick that in the chat there, Kayla put up that retrofit guide. It's fantastic. We've showed a bunch of the different pictures from that guide. I highly recommend taking a look at that. If you didn't get the link, just type in home retrofit guide. It'll pop right up in your search bar. Has a lot of really good tips and tricks. And then we have all this stuff posted on our OSU website for extension as well, the fire program stuff that Kayla showed. Just type in OSU fire program and you'll see all the stuff we've done on this stuff.
Okay. Pam put, the practicality of the webinars is essential. Now I have a list of 10 things I can do and hopefully not be too expensive, enabling folks to be proactive, which is fabulous. So thank you for that, Pam. You know, like Chris expertly quoted John, right? Like we do recognize a lot of this is hard work and it's not overnight, right? So if you can only do 2 things this spring and summer, do those 2 things, right? And then try to make a plan from there. Sometimes when we talk about defensible space, home hardening, folks get overwhelmed and then we're just like, oh, well, I can't do anything, right? Just do one thing and start there. But we're so glad that this gave you some inspiration to kind of kick off the spring and get ready for fire season.
And then quick thought, Allison, there was a comment about the screening. That tight mesh screening costs a little bit more. You're right, it does cost a little bit more. There are some opportunities to shop around a little bit for that. And what we talked to a local hardware store was, hey, we really would like to see this stuff. And they were able to bring in a pallet of it and the price dropped significantly. And then we made sure that everybody knew that so they would go and purchase it and help that local business out. So think about things like that. These suppliers want to work with you guys. So have a conversation with True Value or whoever your local supplier is and let them know that you want to do it. And people will buy it if we have it. So
the one other plug I'll put in is, I've got kids that are in their early 20s that like to come home for the weekend, and bring their pets with them and all that. If you're unable to, to physically do some of this work, make that list. When they come home, trade them for a meal, just there's so many different opportunities out there to look and to get this work done, neighborhood kids, going around pushing a lawnmower, have them get a rake, lots of different opportunities there.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, well, I will say just for a couple housekeeping things, because folks did ask, for some of our folks that joined us a little bit late, we did record this. So we are going to post this on YouTube as well as online on kind of the page where you registered for this. And then we'll kind of put a plug on some of our social media platforms as well. So if you missed the first half, don't worry, we recorded it, even given my technology glitch there for a hot minute. So other than that, I want to thank you all so much for your time and give you back the rest of your Thursday. And thank you so much to our presenters.
Thank you all.